Oil was not supposed to make them kings. At the start of the 20th century, the House of Saud ruled nothing but sand, tribal loyalties, and debt. No empire, no global power, no modern army, just a family surviving on protection deals, religious authority, and fragile alliances in one of the harshest regions on Earth. While Europe was industrializing and America was building factories, the Arabian Peninsula was considered economically useless. Then one discovery quietly rewired global power forever, and the House of Saud positioned itself at the exact center of it. The twist is this: the Saudi dynasty did not rise because it was rich. It became rich because it understood power before money arrived. And when oil finally surfaced, the family already controlled the political, religious, and military foundations needed to turn a natural resource into a permanent dynasty. That combination is rare, and history shows it almost never ends peacefully. Before oil, the Arabian Peninsula was fragmented. Tribal warfare was constant. Empires like the Ottomans ruled in theory, but not in practice. In this vacuum, Abdulaziz ibn Saud began rebuilding his family's lost territory in the early 1900s. He did it through a calculated alliance with religious leaders who followed a strict interpretation of Islam. This partnership gave him legitimacy, discipline, and a reason to unify tribes under a single banner. Power came first, money came later. By 1932, Ibn Saud declared the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It was a political victory, not an economic one. The new state was nearly bankrupt. Revenues were thin, dependent on pilgrimage taxes and foreign stipends. The kingdom survived on loans and promises. This is the part often ignored. The Saudi state existed before oil made it viable. Without oil, it likely would have collapsed. Then American geologists arrived. In the 1930s, U.S. oil companies were searching globally for new reserves. Britain already dominated much of the Middle East, but Saudi Arabia was different. It was poor, unstable, and politically isolated. That made it negotiable. In 1938, oil was discovered in commercial quantities. What followed was not instant wealth, but a long-term bargain that reshaped global finance. American companies provided expertise, infrastructure, and capital. The House of Saud provided absolute control over land, labor, and law. The deal created Aramco, and with it, a new model of power. Oil profits did not flow to citizens. They flowed upward. The state became the sole distributor of wealth, turning loyalty into a financial transaction. This is where the dynasty locked itself into permanence. Instead of taxing citizens, the Saudi state paid them. Jobs, housing, fuel subsidies, and social benefits were funded by oil revenue. In return, political silence was expected. No representation, no accountability, no dissent. This reversed the traditional relationship between people and government. When citizens do not fund the state does not fear citizens. Within decades, oil transformed Saudi Arabia from a fragile kingdom into a strategic necessity. The United States did not protect Saudi Arabia because of shared values. It protected Saudi Arabia because global energy stability depended on it. In return, the dollar became tied to oil, and oil became tied to American military power. The House of Saud stood between them. This arrangement created an illusion of stability. But under the surface, pressure was building. Oil prices fluctuated, populations grew, expectations rose. The royal family expanded into the thousands, power concentrated tighter, and the entire system became dependent on a single resource with no backup plan. Before continuing, if you value documentaries that explain power, money, and history without slogans or noise, subscribe to Fiscora Empire. This channel exists to show how systems really work, not how they are advertised. By the 1970s, the House of Saud was no longer just a ruling family. It was a global financial actor. Oil shocks triggered recessions in the West. Petrodollars flooded international banks. Saudi money influenced markets, wars, and diplomacy. But with greater power came greater risk. The dynasty now had enemies it could not control, and internal contradictions it could not escape. Oil had made the House of Saud indispensable. It had also made it vulnerable. What happens when a dynasty built on a single resource faces a world that wants less of it? What happens when loyalty bought with money becomes too expensive to maintain? And what happens when power depends on external protection rather than internal legitimacy? Those questions would define the next phase of Saudi history, and the breaking point would come faster than anyone expected. Oil did not just bring wealth, it brought exposure. As Saudi Arabia's oil output expanded after World War II, the kingdom moved from isolation to the center of global politics almost overnight. Revenues exploded, but so did dependence. The House of Saud now ruled a state whose survival hinged on global demand. Foreign technology and external security guarantees, this was the rise phase, but it carried the seeds of a breaking point. In the 1950s and 1960s, oil income was reshaping Saudi society at a speed no traditional system could absorb. Nomadic tribes were pushed into cities. Religious authority was reinforced to stabilize change. The royal family expanded its reach into every institution. Ministries, military leadership, business licenses, land ownership, and banking all traced back to royal approval. The state became personal. Power was centralized not just in the family, but in a small inner circle within it. At the same time, a dangerous imbalance formed. Oil revenue replaced economic productivity. The private sector became dependent on government contracts. Citizens grew accustomed to state support rather than opportunity. This worked as long as oil prices stayed high. But history does not freeze for convenience. The 1973 oil embargo marked a turning point. Saudi Arabia demonstrated it could weaponize oil, triggering inflation and recession across the United States and Europe. On paper, this looked like peak power. In reality, it exposed how fragile the system was. Global consumers began looking for alternatives. Strategic petroleum reserves were built. Energy efficiency became policy. The seeds of future decline were planted at the moment of greatest leverage. Inside the kingdom, oil money masked deeper issues. Population growth accelerated. Youth unemployment quietly rose. The cost of maintaining loyalty increased every year. The royal family itself ballooned into thousands of princes, all drawing from the same revenue stream. The system required constant expansion just to stand still. Then came the shocks. In 1979, two events shattered the illusion of absolute control. The Iranian Revolution overthrew a US-backed monarchy and replaced it with an ideological regime hostile to Saudi Arabia. The same year, extremists seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca, accusing the Saudi leadership of corruption and betrayal of Islamic values. This was not a foreign threat. It was internal rebellion, fueled by the very system oil had built. The response reshaped the dynasty's future. To preserve power, the House of Saud doubled down on religious conservatism at home and strategic alignment abroad. Billions were poured into religious institutions, social controls tightened, political reform was postponed indefinitely, stability was purchased, not earned. Meanwhile, oil prices collapsed in the 1980s. Revenues fell sharply, but spending commitments remained. For the first time, Saudi Arabia ran deficits, not as a temporary issue, but as a structural reality. The state borrowed, reserves declined. The model showed cracks. The breaking point was no longer theoretical, it was mathematical. Every year, more citizens entered the workforce than the state could employ. Every year, subsidies grew more expensive. Every year, oil faced competition, yet reform was dangerous. Reducing benefits risked unrest. Taxing citizens risked demands for representation. Diversifying the economy required loosening control. The House of Saud chose delay. By the time the 21st century arrived, the dynasty had achieved something unprecedented. It had turned oil into generational power. But it had also locked itself into a system where change threatened survival. The very mechanism that created stability now made adaptation nearly impossible. And that contradiction would define everything that came next. The 21st century arrived with both unprecedented wealth and unprecedented risk. Saudi Arabia had transformed from a desert kingdom into a linchpin of global energy, with reserves, investments, and influence that no other family-controlled state could match. Yet the core problem remained unchanged. Power and loyalty were bought with oil, and oil was no longer a guaranteed path to dominance. Global energy demand was shifting. Alternative sources emerged, and social expectations evolved faster than the old systems could adapt. By the 2000s, the Saudi state faced pressures on multiple fronts. Internally, a rapidly growing young population expected jobs, education, and participation. The royal family, now numbering in the thousands of princes, required continuous redistribution of wealth to maintain political silence and loyalty. Every subsidy, every handout, every state-funded job carried a hidden cost. If removed, it risked unrest or rebellion. Externally, the global economy was diversifying, with oil no longer the unchallenged currency of power. Nations invested in renewables, strategic reserves, and alternative suppliers. Even the perception of Saudi indispensability began to wobble. The dynasty's solution was twofold: consolidation and modernization under strict control. The rise of figures like Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman reflected a new strategy. Power had to be concentrated in fewer hands to make decisive reforms possible. Initiatives like Vision 2030 aimed to diversify the economy, reduce dependency on oil, and create new industries. The plan was ambitious: tourism, entertainment, technology, and privatization. Yet every reform also threatened the old balance. Too much change could alienate conservative factions and destabilize the religious legitimacy that the dynasty relied on. Financially, the House of Saud continued to use global markets to reinforce power. SOV, wealth funds, international investments, and strategic partnerships gave the family leverage far beyond the borders of the kingdom. Billions of dollars flowed through London, New York, and Hong Kong. Each investment strengthened the perception of stability and control. But every dollar spent externally was a dollar not used to manage internal pressures. The balancing act had never been more delicate. Modern parallels emerge when examining this system. Look at any resource-rich autocracy today: power bought with commodities, loyalty maintained with subsidies, and social stability dependent on global demand for a single resource. The lessons of the House of Saud are cautionary. Wealth alone does not guarantee security. Absolute control is always fragile if it rests on an external asset rather than internal legitimacy. Systems that buy obedience rather than earn trust will always face shocks, and when they come, the consequences can ripple globally. By 2020, Saudi Arabia was at a crossroads. The economy faced low oil prices, regional conflicts, and growing domestic expectations. Reforms promised growth, but also required cultural and political shifts. The dynasty had to navigate modernization without undermining its own authority. One misstep could ignite unrest or weaken the carefully maintained alliances that had protected it for generations. The story of the House of Saud demonstrates three critical takeaways. First, power precedes wealth. The dynasty's rise depended on religious legitimacy, military control, and strategic alliances before oil. Second, reliance on a single resource, no matter how vast, introduces fragility. Oil created wealth and influence, but also dependence on external markets and constant internal redistribution. Third, stability bought with money is temporary. Real resilience comes from institutions, trust, and adaptability, not subsidies or petrol. The warning is clear. Any system where loyalty is purchased rather than earned carries hidden risks. Populations, economies, and markets are dynamic. External shocks, shifting expectations, and internal contradictions can destabilize even the most powerful dynasties. The House of Saud illustrates how oil can create global influence, but also how it can entrench a system that struggles to survive when the world changes. If this exploration of power, wealth, and strategy changed how you see global politics, subscribe to Fiscora Empire for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. Comment your thoughts on whether resource wealth creates long-term stability or just a temporary illusion. Share this video with someone curious about how power is bought, maintained, and challenged. The story of oil and the House of Saud is still unfolding, and the lessons are relevant to every nation, every economy, and every individual who wants to understand the real mechanics behind global influence.